This little stack of folded paper doesn't look like much yet, but this is exactly where every book really gets its start, the book block. And if you can get this part right, you'll end up with something like these. And my toughest quality inspector, and looks like Patso approves. Thanks, buddy. Thanks. That's very sweet of you. And we're just focused on the book block today. Turning it into a finished book will be its own video later on this week. I hope. I gotta find some time. But basically, the paper that I'm using is just 24-pound Astrobright. Full honesty, it's just what I can afford right now, and that's kind of the point. I don't need expensive materials to make something that I'm proud of. It's just fun colored paper, and it runs through my Brother printer great with the toner. So I'll be making my own wax thread by hand, showing you how I make two regular, just like sewing threads waxed up together to keep a little bit of visual interest and keeps it from snapping on this book this small. And from there, we're going to get to the part where most people mess up, punching clean station holes and building signatures so everything lines up. And stick around, because I did make a little tool for free out of some scrap material that I got from a local framer, which makes this whole thing like 10 times easier. And honestly, I just wish somebody had shown me this when I first started. We'll finish up with the basic glue up, the stitch that I typically use, the French stitch, step by step, just so you can follow right along. So let's get into it. And for the mini notebooks in this series, I'm using between 5 and 6 signatures for the whole book. It kind of depends on what the color combinations end up turning into. I think this one right here is going to be using groups of 5 sheets in their signature, so 5 folios to create the one signature, and then it's 6 signatures total. Here we're basically just folding over by hand, just giving a general idea of about halfway through the sheet. These sheets are cut larger than the actual book will be in the end, so we'll do a little bit of paper trimming, but the more accurate we can be here, the straighter our dot grid lines are going to be for later. So this helps to keep everything a little bit more organized. Basically what I'm trying to push through here is making sure that at least the bottom edge of these sheets come to the same corner, and you will get some fanning out. So as you stretch the paper over itself, what is this, 5-6 times now, in each individual signature, the edge of the paper will change depth from the spine because of how much paper it has to wrap around. So you're going to get this little bit of fanning at the end of each of the book signatures as you fold around. But generally speaking, as long as you're making sure that the bottom edge of that sheet is aligned on both the front and back side of that signature, you should get a nice fold. So I'm just using my bone folder really lightly against the edge of these signatures that I've put together. Each signature is 5 folios, or 5 little sheets of paper that are just cut 8.5 by 11 sheet, cut down in half after it's been printed, and that creates your signature. So I typically do between 4 and 6 pages for a signature. One thing I'm being really careful of is not to press the bone folder too hard, because if you press the bone folder too hard into the paper, it can actually pull on some of the fibers of the paper, and it can actually crinkle the paper if you go too hard on it. So trying to make sure that your signatures are nice and straight and uncrimped at the spine edge there. So another DIY trick that I know of that I've sort of tested out, and it's worked pretty well. I know I'm using a bone folder here, but you can actually use all sorts of materials to do the folding of these sheets to get a nice crisp edge. You can use the edge of a permanent marker, like the marker cap, works pretty good. You can use your thumbnail. I've used a coffee cup before because that's all that I had that was really smooth. Pretty much anything can work as long as you're making sure that the material doesn't tear or get squished underneath it. Gift cards, that kind of thing will also work as well. But really all we're looking for is a nice clean edge. You don't need to be super tight. If it's too pointy, that's actually making it easier to tear later. And we're going to be putting it in a press, so the press will do a lot of the work for us. So now that we're done with the folding of the signatures, and we gathered some other materials here, this is the fun little tool that I built, just some scrap mat board from a local framing shop. You can see it's got that 45-degree beveled edge on it, which is really, really nice for this awl that I've got. Basically all that I use to make this is just cutting away some of the extra material, and I've got my measurements all listed out here, and then digging a razor blade into the edge of that mat board just by a tiny little bit actually allows the awl to get stuck ever so slightly in those little divots, and it makes for a really easy station punch that is really, really consistent across the board. And one of the things that I'm noting here is just the bottom edge of these sheets of paper couldn't fit through, or couldn't get printed on by the Brother printer that I've got. So I just want to make sure that whenever I put these things into the ruler up against the edge of this ruler, that I'm keeping the far edge of that sheet of paper where it couldn't get printed down away from this corner here. It's going to make sure that all of our pages line up so that when we trim the book later on, all of the pages will have a full dot grid and won't have some of that extra margin at the bottom. So the beveled edge of the material that I got from the framing store is like a 45-degree angle, and it actually really, really helps to make sure that your awl is pushing in at the right angle too. And so once we've got our initial station punches in, the holes are still pretty small. So what I like to do is actually push the awl through additionally about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch the rest of the way through, and the thickness of the awl gets slightly wider the further up the awl you go for this one. So it helps to allow for an easy transition of the needle through the paper signature in our next phase here. But generally, about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch should be more than enough to make sure that your needle is going to go through. Sometimes the eye of the needle that you're using is going to be bigger or smaller depending on what kind of needle it is. I just use a regular embroidering needle to do most of mine. So really 1/8 of an inch of a push through on the back side of these station holes here is really plenty to get my needle through. You can see here there's just a little bit of blowout on the back side, just to get a better sense of exactly how far that is. Again, it's not a ton, just a little bit to make sure that the station hole is wide enough for the needle and the thread to pass on through. You don't need a gigantic hole on the back side here. And just making sure that our signature is set into that ruler with the bottom edge of the printed paper at the bottom edge of the ruler as well, making sure that our dot grid is all the way up to the top. You can use blank paper for this too. I love doing dot grids, whether it's square dot grids or hex dot grids. I think they just make for a more interesting paper interior to write on. Just a couple final station punches here, and I'll sort of fast forward through the rest of them here. And oftentimes what I'll do when I'm actually making a book, I don't like to make spines for my book block ahead of time. I like to make them after I've actually made the book block. So one of the things I'll do here is I'll measure just in inches. We're looking at just over 1/4 inch, which isn't the most accurate, so oftentimes I'll actually go down to millimeters and make sure that I'm actually measuring as accurately as I can. So this is about 7 millimeters across, and that's going to be the width of the spine material that I'm going to be using later on. If you're doing a whole bunch of books at once, generally speaking, you can make spines in advance, but specifically for this demo, I'm adjusting the page count or the folio count of my signatures, and I sort of want to make sure that this book goes off without a hitch in the end, so I'm going to do this all custom. And again, I'm only just using a regular embroidery needle. I don't have anything super fancy here. I just got this nice little this nice little messy case from like a Goodwill or something like that, just to hold all my different sewing threads. And these aren't anything special either. These are just regular Amazon, like 30-40 packs or whatever. Just regular embroidery, not even embroidery thread, just sewing thread. And the way that I've been choosing my materials for these is just looking at the book block color and finding a color combination of thread that looks like it would match up really nice. So now we're going to make our wax thread that will hold on to the paper really, really well. And it's like the slightest bit sticky. It's not sticky like honey, but it's tacky. And the tack of the thread that we're making here is what's going to hold on to the tension as we continue to build the book block with the stitches. So you don't have to wax your thread if you don't have beeswax like this block here. I've used all sorts of stuff. You can use lip balm. Lip balm is not a bad option. You just have to be really careful about leaving excess material on it. So if you're going to use something like a lip balm or chapstick, you can, but make sure that you run some paper towels over that material afterwards to make sure you're getting rid of all the excess. So if you've got 6 signatures in your book block, you want 6 lengths of your thread to be able to accommodate that, plus some extra at the end. I know you don't have to have extra, but I find it makes tying knots just that much easier, and I'd rather be overzealous in making sure that I've got enough thread than needing to go back and splice new thread in. So here we're just pulling the pair of threads that I put together just right through with a little bit of pressure against my thumb up against that block of beeswax. And what we're really listening for here is that sound right there. Once you get that sort of sound, you know you've got enough beeswax on there. So then just making sure we do the same thing on the other side. So I started out halfway through the thread, just pulling towards the end of the original knot, and then flipping it over, making sure I get the other end of the thread as well. You can see here how the beeswax sometimes twists the 2 threads together in this really nice pattern, so you can see it a little bit easier here against this white block here, this extra scrap mat. So just threading the needle here. I do have some nice threading needles, but one of the things I want to try to bring to this practice is making sure that I can use just whatever I've got on hand. So these are just really basic embroidery needles. Sometimes the eye of the needle for other ones that you can find are just way too large, and it'll actually puncture more of the paper as you poke through these signature station holes that we've already made. So you want the eye of the needle to be incredibly thin so that it's not additionally affecting the size of the holes that you're punching through. And we're going to be doing a French stitch on this book block, and just passing through, starting from the outside of the signature, passing through the far end of that book block, coming in through the next station on the inside of the book, then out the next, in the next, out the next. The first signature on this is the simplest stitch of the French stitch. One thing you do want to watch out for is making sure that if you're ever going to be pulling tension out of your book stitch, that you never pull against or back the same direction that you just stitched from. That's going to be allowing your paper to tear, but if you pull in the same direction that you were just stitching, you will alleviate that pressure. And making sure that our second signature here is lined up on the right side, so we're keeping our dots all to one end and our margined side all over to the other end here. We're going to be stacking that second signature right on top of the first, now that we've gone all the way through. The last station hole, we're going to plug right, jumping from the first signature up into the second one, going into the interior of that book. Pushing out the second. Pulling just a little bit of gentle pressure here. And this is where the French stitch actually starts. So what you're going to do to pull this first piece in is go underneath the first signature's stitch. So you can see that little crisscross there. Go once underneath and then back into that second signature that you're plugging through. So this is the third station hole in signature number 2 on the interior of the book now. Pulling some of that tension out. Again, we don't want to get too tight. And then you're going to go through the interior of the book, back out to the outside. You do that same thing again. You're going to make sure you get through that 4th station hole. Pull a little bit of tension out. We're going to go underneath. If I can get there. Careful not to poke myself too much. Nobody wants blood on their book. And then pushing back through that same station. So again, we just went underneath once for this second signature. We're going to push back through that same station, back into the interior of the book, now pushing out to the exterior, the last station and signature 2. Pull a little bit of that tension out. Again, you don't want to pull too hard, because if you pull too hard, you might tear some of the paper. What we're doing here is I'm pulling and using my finger as an anchor to help get some of that tension out. Nice gentle but snug pull here. I'm just going to make a quick square knot at the end of the book block. Make sure these signature holes are as aligned as possible before I make this knot, because this is going to be the pattern moving up the rest of the book block here. So just a quick little square knot. And we're going to move on to signature number 3. So with even signature book blocks, I like to keep at least a couple inches of thread at the head of the book, or at the tail of the book, depending on which direction you're going, so that I can use that last piece of thread to make a really good knot for the last signature that we end up stitching in. So you'll see that trick in a few minutes here. So moving on to the 3rd signature, again, we've already made the knot on the 1st and 2nd signatures. We're just going to be pulling our needle straight in towards that next signature through the 1st station hole. If I can find that goddamn hole. It looks like I even repunched this one once. So pulling as much tension out as we can without tearing the paper. Again, just moving up and down that signature. And here's where the next phase of the French stitch comes in, because you want to pull out some tension. And since you've already got one crossover in the 2nd signature, you want to move in the same direction that you're about to stitch into. You want to hook under that side. So there's a little crisscross in there. And you want to hook in your next stitch underneath the far side of where that next stitch is going to go. So you always want to hook into the side that you're about to stitch into, is a general rule of thumb here. And it's going to create a nice pattern as we go forward. Again, it's going to be that same thing. Moving out of the signature block, out the station hole, pulling some tension out, and then threading the needle underneath the previous signature's stitch on the edge that's closest to your next station hole. So you can see this one here, it's already been pulled through, and we're just going to go back up towards that 3rd signature. Right up through the station hole there, pull out some of the tension, back out the 6th station hole, remove some tension. And what we're going to do here is we're going to do just a basic kettle stitch, excuse me. So you're going to push the needle through and in between the 1st and 2nd signature right there, and then pull a little bit out, but before you go all the way tight, you want to pull back through that loop that you just made. So I've hooked the needle underneath the initial 1st and 2nd 6th station loop, and I'm actually pulling that through in a nice little kettle stitch here, and that's what's going to keep the rest of the book block moving along. So it's going to be that same pattern, just up and down the book block. And we're going the opposite direction. So we're making sure that our next pull down into the third signature is going to go on the far edge of that same stitch that we just did before. So onto the right edge of that same stitch now. You can see how the French stitch elements are starting to really be visible now. You've got one stitch on one side, then it jogs over, then it jogs over. And try to keep the edges of the book block aligned so that the top edge, or the edge that's closest to the bottom left of the screen here, is where I'm trying to make sure that all of the edges of the paper are lined up as evenly as possible as I go. Again, you don't need this to be super, super tight. We're going to be gluing it up. We're going to be putting it in a press. So we just need a reasonable amount of tension here. Anything too tight or pulled too hard might rip the paper, or make the end of the book block in that signature area, or excuse me, the station punching area too tight, and it's actually going to bow out in the middle. You can see here I got a little bit of a funky wax thread knot going on here. I gotta do a little bit of solving out. And then after that kettle stitch, we're going to do one final square knot with the additional material that we left behind from that first stitch. This actually looks like I missed the true classic kettle stitch. I just did a simple under over there. But now we're going to trim a little bit of the excess off and make sure we can get a little square knot at the end of the book block here, and that's going to wrap it up for us. Final trim here. Not too bad. A couple of mistakes along the way, but you know, nothing's perfect. Nice little smooth out here. Here's a collection of some of the other book blocks that we've put together. Again, not everything's perfect. We got a couple of ones that are 5 signatures, some that are 6. And depending on how tight you're pulling these things together as you go along, you might get a little bit of a rainbow effect on the interior of that spine there. And then what we need next is a little book press to glue these up. So I got this little guy on Amazon, and it's made of pine, which is not ideal because it bends too much, but at least in the interim, until I get the rest of my clamps put together, this is going to be mostly fine. One of the things I have changed in my practice after making this initial video is that I'm no longer putting the book block outside of the edge of the press as I'm doing my glue ups. I found that this just creates an uneven amount of pressure on the interior of the book block just in front of the spine and those signature holes. So when you actually put it into the book later on, you get this weird sort of like bowing system that starts to happen. So I think for an initial book, a single book block in this press at this distance is mostly fine. I just want to make sure that if the book block is too far extended out from this press, it's going to create a bowing of the signature holes in those stations, so that when you actually glue it up, it's wider at the base than it should be. So I just want to make sure that I'm giving this as much pressure as close to the edge of those signature holes, those station holes, as I reasonably can without getting the glue stuck on the actual book press itself. So it's like 2 millimeters, a millimeter over the edge there, which again, for this instance is going to be fine, but I think I'm going to improve on this later on. And then when I'm doing my glue ups, I'll often find just like a couple of random boxes that I've got around, just because I like to be able to glue straight down when I possibly can. I'm just using a little bit of PVA glue here and a brush, and just applying it on the stitches and in between the actual signatures themselves. You just want to make sure that the glue gets pushed down in between the signatures, just a tiny little bit. You don't want to get too much. But especially later on, we're going to be adding a lot of glue to the back of this to put the rest of the book block into the actual case. So we want to make sure that there's a really good liquid barrier between the book block and the rest of the amount of glue that we're adding. So I'm starting off thin, adding just 1 coat here. I'll probably end up doing 2 or 3 coats like this in a really thin manner, making sure that it's really spread out so that when we end up glopping on a whole bunch of glue later, that it doesn't soak through the end of the book block and into the pages, which is going to make them wrinkle later. Yeah, I'm just trying to work this glue all the way through each of the signatures and try to get it underneath some of those stitch threads, so that after this first coat dries, we'll have a nice clean waterproof barrier for when those later glue runs come in. Just trying to make sure that my glue brush doesn't dry out on me. So I'll let this sit for 15-20 minutes or so and come back for the next one. And just a little bit of tidy up. And I hope you guys will join me for part 2 coming up later on. Thanks for watching.